Hi, so my name is Madeline Rouse, and today I'll be talking about some of the ways that psychology can help us make better maps. You can find a PDF copy of my presentation at the link in the bottom right corner. I know it's a little hard to see. I will also be posting it to Slack right after this, and you can see all my slides. So let me start by briefly setting some expectations about what this talk will cover and what it won't. In brief, this is not a tutorial or a full explanation about how to make psychologically informed maps, but it is an invitation to start thinking about how accessibility can be thought about more broadly and through a psychology lens. So I'll be taking you kind of down that path and leading you in a direction that I've been thinking about for a few years now. Let's get into it. So psychology is a super broad field with lots of subfields, like a lot of subfields. And I would argue that every single one of these could provide novel insights into the science of cartography and spatial communication. But I only specialize in two of these subfields, and they're the ones that I believe relate the most to map design. So today I'm going to focus on linguistic psychology, which is also known as psycholinguistics, and spatial psychology, otherwise known as spatial cognition, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, but we're going to cover it again. So psycholinguistics is the study of mental processes involved in the understanding, production, and acquisition of language. And it asks questions like, how do people learn languages? Is language innate to the human brain, and would it develop if we were never taught a language as a child? How is language stored in and retrieved from the brain? And does the language that you speak influence how you perceive the world around you? Spatial cognition is the study of how individuals interpret, interact with, and mentally store information from spatial products such as maps. And it asks questions like, how accurately can someone read a map? And which parts of the map might be confusing to them or to everyone? What decisions will someone make based on a given map that they have? And what factors influence those choices that they make? How does spatial cognition change based on the situation that someone is in? And how do cultural and educational backgrounds influence spatial cognition? So we're going to talk about these two primarily today in relationship to cartography. I'm interested in the intersection between these two fields of psychology and cartography, and how psychology can provide insights into how best to design maps. Because psychology answers questions about how people interact with and perceive the world around them, it's obvious to me as an artist and a scientist that my cartographic design should be rooted in psychological research. But before we get into the very center of this diagram, let's first talk about the connection between psycholinguistics and spatial cognition. The basic idea here is that the language that we speak can influence the way that we think about spatial relationships, and therefore the way that we read, understand, and use maps. Back in the 1930s, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf came up with a hypothesis that we now call linguistic determinism. They proposed that everyone's thinking and actions are determined by the language that they speak. In practice, it was unfortunately a view that was very strongly rooted in racism and white supremacy. For example, they claim that because Native Americans who speak Hopi don't have a past tense in their language, they can't think about the past. And since this has been completely rejected by psycholinguists because of this idea, we know that it's not true, it's gone. But in its place came linguistic relativity, which is an ongoing topic of research and debate, and it's a softened and, in my opinion, more accurate version of the original hypothesis. It proposes that instead of people's thinking being determined by the language that they speak, instead their thinking and actions can be influenced by the language that they speak. And it focuses more on differences in how people think about a topic based on their language, rather than the existence or absence of that thinking at all. For example, the Hopi people can certainly think about, and they do think about, things that happened in the past. But perhaps their cultural perceptions about the past are different than how the average English speaker perceives past events. I'm going to go into a few more concrete examples here to illustrate the idea and how it relates to spatial thinking, and we're even going to get a little bit of audience participation involved. It'll be fun. So I would like you all to imagine that you are in the place of this green smiley face here, and you're sitting at a table in front of you. On this table are a yellow ball and a blue ball in the places that you see here. Most of us in this room would probably describe the blue ball as being on the right side of the table and the yellow ball as being on the left side. Then I'm going to move your chair and your table so that you're facing a different wall in the same room, and hand you the yellow ball and blue ball, and ask you to place them on the table in the same way that you saw them before. Quick show of hands, how many of us would put them on the table like this? A lot of us. So most English speakers would put the yellow ball on the left and the blue ball on the right, like we talked about before. But when members of certain Australian Aboriginal communities were asked to complete the same task, they put the yellow ball on the far edge of the table and the blue ball closer to themselves. Why? This is attributed to the fact that in many Aboriginal languages, there are no words for right, left, forward, or back. Instead, they use cardinal directions to describe where things are in space in relation to themselves and in relation to each other. Instead of the blue ball being to the right of the yellow ball, the blue ball is to the south of the yellow ball. Instead of me being right-handed, I'm north-handed or east-handed or south-southwest-handed, depending on how I'm facing in space. Already, we can see how this might impact their use of cartographic products versus English speakers. For example, what would a navigation map or a GPS system look like for them versus the average American? Again, it's not that these people who speak these languages can't grasp the concepts of what relational directions like right and left mean, but it would certainly be better to design products for them that take into account their natural way of thinking about these relationships. Another psycholinguistic consideration that could have a big impact on map perception is color. So in English, we use 11 basic color terms, the 6 colors of the rainbow, plus black, white, gray, pink, and brown. But this is not a universal phenomenon, and different languages have different numbers of distinct colors and different dividing lines between them on this color wheel. In Russian, dark blue and light blue are given 2 distinct color names, Sini and Goluboy. And I don't speak Russian, so apologies if I completely pronounce those wrong, but that's what I got online. But consider, what impact could this have on their perception of a symbology that relies on a gradient of shades of blue? As a map maker, why might you opt for a monochromatic color gradient versus a blue-green color gradient, for example? And what consequence could this have on the accurate interpretation of your data? What could be perceived as monochromatic to most of us here could be seen as 2 or even 3 hues of color to other language cultures. In this example projection of an American presidential election, as English speakers and as people familiar with the US, we know that the red and light red represent both represent Republican votes, while dark blue and light blue both represent Democratic votes. But what if light blue and dark blue to us were like blue and green? Would that change our perception of this map? Imagine for a moment that you handed this map to a 4-year-old with no knowledge of American politics. An English-speaking child would likely assume that the red and the light red states have something in common, and the dark blue and light blue states have something in common. But would a Russian-speaking child assume the same thing, or would they see a map with 3 colors emphasized rather than 2 and see 3 categories, therefore? My final color example here is from a language called Dani, which is spoken in part of Indonesia. And in this language, there are actually only 2 terms for color. One for dark colors, mili, and one for light colors, mola. And I've kind of broken up the color wheel like they would perceive it here. Would this lead them to draw unintentional connections between yellow and orange symbols on a map, or between purple and green ones? Again, to be very clear, speakers of language like Dani with standard color vision are still able to see all of these colors on this color wheel. And they're able to visually differentiate between different shades and hues. But what's up for debate here is not what they can see, but the mental associations that they might have in their language that we don't have in English-speaking cultures. For example, red, yellow, green, and blue are commonly used in the US and other countries as being 4 distinct color categories. You see it in everything from kids' toys to Pokemon to personality type charts and even NACIS merch. But if you chose to use these to represent distinct and unrelated categories for a Dani audience, you could be unintentionally signaling connections between categories that you don't mean. Hopefully that gave you an idea of how even one aspect of psychology, the language we speak, could have a big impact on the way that we read, understand, and use maps. I'm a linguistics nerd, so that was fun for me to do a deeper dive into, but there are so many other considerations we need to make when understanding how our intended audience will use our maps. For example, how educated is your audience? How educated are they specifically on the topic of your map? What cultural values, beliefs, and associations may your audience have that could bias their understanding or action? Do they have strong pre-existing feelings towards your topic? What personal and professional experience does your reader have with spatial thinking? Are they GIS professionals, mountain climbers who use maps frequently, toddlers who might be using a map for the first time? What's the age of your audience? Is it a specific age or a range? How could your knowledge of your audience's age inform your assumptions about their cultural biases and education level, or vice versa? What is the current emotional or mental state of your reader based on the topic of your map? Why are they reading your map? Are they in an emergency or a crisis situation? Are they outside, inside, somewhere busy and loud, maybe somewhere with limited space? Is your map intended for an audience with a specific disability? And even if it's not, is it possible that someone with a disability will need to access your map? And hint, it almost always is true. And how might these differences affect the way that they perceive or are able to process your map? So we're hopefully on the same page about why considering psychology could help us make important and consequential design choices in our maps. We did a deeper dive into linguistic and cultural thinking considerations, but we know that there are many more factors out there that also deserve full consideration. And if we all agree on that, then this talk was successful. But since we have some more time, let's look at a map together and see how these ideas could help us ask critical questions and make more informed, accessible, and effective design choices. In practice, it probably won't be super common for any of us to be making a map for an audience that only has 2 words for colors, or where the difference between right and left and west and east make a super big difference. But we can use the same process of questioning our assumptions and thinking about how others might interpret our choices differently in every single map that we make. One of my personal favorite applications for this is in emergency hazard mapping, where the rapid usefulness of a map can be the difference between life and death. So this is a tsunami evacuation map of Seaside, Oregon, published by the Oregon Department of Geography in 2021. And it's kind of difficult to read on the screen here because of the size, but I'll briefly go over the basic components of the map and how we could approach an additional design through a psychological lens. In brief, this map shows the evacuation zones for a distant tsunami in orange and the additional evacuation zones for a local earthquake and tsunami in yellow. Evacuation routes are shown via arrows, and there are various symbols throughout the map for hospitals, schools, assembly areas, and such. I'm assuming that this map is for planning purposes in advance of a tsunami, and it would probably be very useful to folks living in the area to determine the best evacuation routes from their home, school, or workplace. But as a town built on tourism, this map just doesn't quite cut it in the event of an actual tsunami evacuation. Even if a beach visitor happens to have this map on their person during a warning or earthquake, it could take a considerable amount of time for them to orient themselves with this map, and they would have to use it while reading it sideways, since they would be traveling away from the beach in an eastward direction. Add considerable stress and panic to this already complex task, and you could have a huge disaster on your hands. In this case, we see that this map, while accessible and effective for an audience who is familiar with the map's spatial content and is in a calm emotional and mental state, is actually very inaccessible to an audience with different psychological factors at hand, namely a lack of familiarity with the area and an altered mental state. On top of this, perhaps we have visitors who can't read English or are colorblind or are unfamiliar with tsunamis due to their age or personal background. Seaside also has a couple other paper maps with similar designs, and in my opinion, they're overly complex to read in emergency situations, providing only street names for orientation, and they use a traditional north-south orientation that doesn't match how they would be used for navigation in these situations. To be really clear, I'm not claiming that these maps are bad or poorly designed or not useful. Joanna Merson actually did a presentation on these exact maps at NACIS 2019, and they're very thoughtfully designed. But they don't cover all the bases. No map does. And this is why it's sometimes necessary to design multiple maps for different psychological factors. These maps are fantastic, but we need to make some others to fully cover a range of potential use cases. This is a map I quickly designed in my cartography class a couple years ago to fill in part of this access gap. Rather than being a paper map, a series of maps like this could be posted on a street corners or signposts or bulletin boards near popular tourist areas. The user is already located, the map is oriented in the direction that they would be facing, away from the beach, and the reader is given one clear direction: go forward to safety. With this map, it's unnecessary to read street signs, route plan, or orient yourself. For those not in an emergency situation, the inset map still provides more detailed information about evacuation routes and danger zones, but when crisis is imminent, the most important information is obvious and easy to use. All of this helps give our intended audience, tourists fleeing a tsunami, access to the information they need in the situation that they're in. To conclude, this whole presentation is based on the assumption that maps are only useful if they can be successfully used by your audience in whatever situation. And the goal is to make maps accessible and effective for that audience. We want to meet them where they're at instead of making them do extra psychological or cognitive legwork to get to what message you're trying to send. And of course, our goal as map makers is to empower people to make informed decisions. So why wouldn't we want to make the best maps possible? Anyway, that is my presentation. Thank you so much, and I am open to questions. You can also connect with me here. So the question was about how, on my topic of needing to make perhaps multiple maps for a certain situation based on different use cases. I think that it's almost always necessary to make multiple maps, and I was having a conversation with another NACIS member yesterday about the same thing, and that, for example, if you need to make a map for a community that needs like a 3:1 color contrast ratio, that is perfect. We should totally make those maps for those communities. But perhaps in doing so, we make it so that people that perceive color in a different way can't access that map. So I think there needs to be a consideration about how accessibility needs can be completely different. Maybe they don't always overlap. And sometimes we need to make two or even more of a series of maps so that within a series, there's one that meets each person's needs. And of course, that's time consuming, but it's an idea.
Wonderful. Let's give her another
Okay.
round of applause.
Thank you.